In 1092, Emperor Alexios I did something no Roman emperor had ever done in 800 years. He looked at the gold coin that had defined his empire, the coin that had been the most trusted currency on earth for 7 centuries, and he admitted it was worthless. The solidus, once 97% pure gold, had been debased so aggressively that the coins circulating in Constantinople's markets contained less than 10% gold. The rest? Bronze and copper, dressed up to look like money. The greatest empire the medieval world had ever known was circulating pocket change and calling it treasure. Byzantium didn't fall to swords. It was destroyed by its own economy. And nobody in the history books wants to talk about why. Every empire that ever collapsed had one thing in common. It wasn't a stronger enemy. It wasn't a weaker army. It was a currency that stopped telling the truth. And the Byzantine Empire, the eastern half of Rome that survived 1,000 years longer than its western twin, provides the most devastating proof of that principle ever recorded. Follow the money. For nearly 700 years, the Byzantine solidus was the dollar of the ancient and medieval world. From the markets of Baghdad to the trading posts of Scandinavia, from the Silk Roads of China to the shores of West Africa, the solidus was the standard. Merchants didn't need to speak Greek, didn't need to worship in a Byzantine church. They just needed to hold that coin, feel its weight, and know it was real. International trade, diplomatic alliances, mercenary contracts, tribute payments, all of it ran on the solidus. The entire global economy of the early medieval world was, in essence, backed by Byzantine gold. That wasn't just currency. That was power in its purest, most portable form. So who controlled the money? The emperor did. Unlike modern economies where central banks operate with at least some nominal independence, the Byzantine emperor had direct, unchecked authority over the mint. He decided how much gold went into each coin. He decided how many coins were struck. He decided, in the most literal sense imaginable, what money was worth. And for centuries, emperors understood that this power came with a sacred obligation. Debase the coin, you debase the empire. Constantine the Great established the solidus at 4.5 grams of nearly pure gold in 309 AD, and his successors maintained that standard with almost religious discipline for generation after generation. The coin was more than money. It was a promise. The physical embodiment of Byzantine credibility. And then the promise was broken. The hidden manipulation began in the 11th century, and it didn't start with foreign invaders. It started with civil wars, palace coups, and an aristocratic class that discovered something dangerous. You could fund a rebellion by secretly reducing the gold content of your coins and minting more of them. Emperor after emperor, usurper after usurper, each one shaved a little more gold from the solidus to pay soldiers, buy loyalty, and finance wars against rival claimants to the throne. Michael IV, Constantine IX. Each reign brought another quiet reduction. No public announcements, no official decrees. Just a coin that got a little lighter, a little less golden, year after year. The history books called it a coincidence. The financial records tell a different story. This was systematic, deliberate debasement carried out by men who understood exactly what they were doing and assumed they'd never face the consequences. But consequences came. Here's the thing. When your currency loses its gold, it doesn't just lose its value, it loses its story. And the story of the solidus was trust. By the 1070s, international merchants had figured out what was happening. Arab traders began weighing Byzantine coins individually instead of accepting them at face value. Italian city-states, particularly Venice and Genoa, smelled blood in the water. They started offering their own currencies as alternatives for Mediterranean trade. The Byzantine economy, which had depended on being the center of global commerce, began hemorrhaging its most valuable asset. Not gold. Credibility. Trade routes shifted. Revenue from customs and tariffs plummeted. The tax base, already strained by decades of civil conflict, contracted violently. The empire that had once funded the largest professional army in Europe could barely afford to garrison its own borders. And this is where the collapse accelerated. Because when you can't pay soldiers, you hire mercenaries. When you can't afford mercenaries, you make concessions. In 1082, Alexios I, the same emperor who would eventually admit his currency was worthless, granted Venice extraordinary trading privileges across the empire, including zero customs duties, in exchange for naval support. Follow the money. Venice didn't send its ships out of Christian solidarity. Venice sent its ships because it had just been handed the economic keys to Constantinople. Byzantine merchants now competed in their own markets against Venetian traders who paid no taxes. Think about that for a second. The empire was funding its own commercial destruction. The Venetians weren't the only ones who profited. Genoa extracted similar concessions. The Normans, who had invaded Byzantine territories in southern Italy, demanded and received enormous financial settlements. The Seljuk Turks, pressing from the east, took not just territory but the agricultural heartland of Anatolia, the breadbasket that had fed Constantinople for centuries. Each loss meant less revenue. Less revenue meant more debasement. More debasement meant less trust. Less trust meant fewer trade partners. The spiral was self-reinforcing, and it was fatal. Alexios did attempt a reset. His hyperpyron, introduced in 1092, was a genuine effort to restore a gold standard, and for a time, under the Komnenian dynasty, it worked. But the structural damage was already done. The Italian merchants had already captured Byzantine trade. The military had already become dependent on foreign mercenaries whose loyalty lasted exactly as long as the payments did. The aristocratic class had already learned that land and titles mattered more than a functioning economy. When the Komnenian dynasty fell in 1185, debasement resumed immediately. The hyperpyron followed the solidus into worthlessness. By 1204, when the soldiers of the Fourth Crusade diverted to Constantinople and sacked the richest city in the Christian world, they weren't attacking a powerful empire. They were looting a carcass. And who organized that diversion? Venice. The same Venice that had been granted those trading privileges a century earlier. The same Venice whose doge, Enrico Dandolo, redirected an entire crusade to eliminate a commercial rival that was already on life support. The Venetians didn't just profit from Byzantine collapse, they engineered its final act. The empire that limped back into existence in 1261 was Byzantine in name only. It controlled a fraction of its former territory, depended entirely on Italian merchants for trade, and spent its final 2 centuries as a geopolitical afterthought. When the Ottoman Turks finally took Constantinople in 1453, they weren't conquering a superpower. They were closing a ledger that had been in the red for 400 years. Now here's what the textbooks won't tell you. The walls of Constantinople were the most formidable fortifications in the world. The Greek fire that defended its harbors was a military technology no enemy could replicate. The strategic position of the city, straddling 2 continents, was unmatched. None of it mattered. Because you cannot defend an empire when the money that pays for the defense is a lie. You cannot maintain alliances when your currency is a joke. You cannot project power when every merchant on the Mediterranean knows your gold isn't gold. But wait. Think about this. The United States dollar became the world's reserve currency in 1944, much as the solidus once dominated global trade. Since 1971, it has been backed by nothing but trust. The national debt exceeds $34 trillion. Foreign nations are actively exploring alternatives to dollar-denominated trade. The pattern isn't identical, but the echoes are loud enough to hear if you're listening. If this changed how you see the fall of empires, A like genuinely helps more people find stories that the mainstream overlooks. And that is how we keep digging. Subscribe to Money and Power, because the next time an empire falls, the warning signs won't be on the battlefield. They'll be in the currency. They always are.